All right, ladies and gentlemen, I will call the meeting to order. It is now 1:22 p.m. on Monday, February 27th, 2017, and I'd like to begin with the roll call and with Commissioner Julie Smith.
Commissioner Julie Smith, present.
Commissioner Lisa Elevich, present.
Commissioner Sally Thompson, present.
Commissioner Otis Cruz, present.
Commissioner W. William Smith, present.
Commissioner Martin Paul, present.
And Tina Stanford also present. And representing the Department of Corrections, I'd like those individuals in the room to state their name for the record.
PIO Bailey, present.
Janet Kopash, Victim Assistance.
Kathy Kiley, Counsel's Office. Tulissa Freeman Brooklyn.
And our cameraman.
Kent Wine Training Academy.
Thank you so much. We also have distinguished guests with us today. We'll get into deeper introductions as the presentation begins, but I would like them to briefly introduce themselves for the record, and we'll start with the gentleman to my left.
Christopher Lawson from the Crime Victims Treatment Center in New York City.
Kimberly Sanchez from the Crime Victims Treatment Center.
And Susan Zenarios, also from the Crime Victims Treatment Center in New York City.
Michael Hollenberg of Safe Horizon, New York City.
Danielle Sarad from Common Justice.
Mary Haviland from the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault.
And I'm Ann Patterson from Steps to End Family Violence in New York City.
Thank you all so much for being with us. I think it'll become apparent for our record why you're here as we proceed. I want to welcome our members of the public who come to our business meetings. Thank you for your attendance. As you know, we don't take questions from the floor during the business meetings, but if you ever have any questions or comments, I'd be delighted to receive them via mail. And if it's appropriate, I will respond to you via mail as well. So thank you again and welcome. I want to move into a review of our minutes from the last meeting of January 2017. Is there a motion with respect to these minutes?
I move that we accept them.
Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any questions, discussion, any recommended changes? I would like to recommend one. I think normally we have at the top the date of the meeting, and in this instance it has today's date. I think it should have the date of the actual meeting in place of February 27, 2017. It should say January 30, 2017, and that's the only recommendation that I would make to a change to these minutes. Is do you still care to move with that amendment? And second? Okay. Any other questions, comments, corrections? All in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Any abstentions? Is there an abstention? Okay. Commissioner Cruz abstains because he was not present for that meeting. Thank you all very much. We spoke in terms of our business last month to our regulations, and our council gave you an update at last month's meeting that is reflected in the minutes from last month's meeting. Nothing has changed since then significantly, so I don't know that you want to add any more comments with respect to the proposed regulations or the status.
Like as mentioned previously, we had a lot of comments. Some were very repetitive, but we had to make sure we read everything very carefully because we just want to make sure we take everything into consideration. So we are actually making some minor changes, nothing enormous, but I think we should be prepared to hopefully vote on them next month.
There aren't any other items of new business that I have to propose at this time for the public portion of our meeting. Is there anything that anyone would like to bring to the board in terms of an item of new business? Okay. All right, thank you. Hearing none, we'll proceed forward. I'm so very delighted to have for you a presentation from experts in the field of victim services to present to us today. The work is ongoing, the research is ongoing, and again, I'm delighted to have for you today individuals who have been immersed in this work for decades, and some newcomers to this work as well. As you all know, and I think it's important for our public to know, the law does require that we consider the viewpoints of victims. In specific instances, they have enhanced rights to actually be heard by a member of the parole board in advance of an individual's interview by the panel. Not in every case, but in certain cases. The more serious, those that you might expect. And that's all contained within executive law that governs our work, 259. Given the fact that we have rights, that victims have rights to be heard and considered as a part of our process, the department has a very robust Office of Victim Services, and we're delighted to have the representative director from that office within the department present here with us as well. She is an expert in her own right, and I think well known to some of our experts that will be presenting here today. And it's just important that we hear from many experts within the discipline of criminal justice so that we can be sure that we are training ourselves and preparing ourselves to make these very challenging decisions with the most up-to-date information available to us. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce this lady to my left, Susan Zanarios, and ask that she take the lead in introducing the people that have come with her here today and introducing herself to you.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you. I just want to say that thank you for having us. The people up here all represent are members of the Downstate Coalition for Crime Victims. And for those of you that don't know, New York State has 5 regional coalitions of crime victims, and we're one of them, and we've been around for over 30 years. And Michael Hollenberg is co-chair with me, and we meet on a monthly basis. And the membership itself, you know, it consists of criminal justice, law enforcement, victim advocates, service providers. It's a wild and diverse group. We have a membership of over 150 and a very, very large mailing list as well. And our mission really is to be a voice for crime victims. And that comes in many different ways. And Michael, I'm going to throw it over to you and give you some fair time to.
Thank you. And thank you again for having us. We meet monthly to look at issues that are of broad relevance to victim services. It's hard to find any subject that everyone's going to agree on, given all the different folks that we have at the table: prosecutors, police, government, providers, advocates, survivors. But what we try to do is come up with presenters or discussions that have cross-cut victim services in any number of ways. So we'll have prosecutors come in and tell us about new things they're thinking of. We'll have academics come in. We even had someone come in who developed an app that he thought would be useful for, I think it was victims of college sexual assault. So we want to hear from people who are doing new and exciting things in the field, and then wrestle with it as an organization, as a coalition. Not that we think we'll all come to an agreement about what the final, what our final opinion will be, but really just to learn from each other, to learn from people who are in this field, who are looking at new and different ways of responding to crime victims, to think, how can we make sure that we're advocating as much as we can for crime victims? After all, it's what we all want to do, everyone who comes to the meeting. And we get about 50 or 60 people sometimes to our meetings each month. So it's a great opportunity for us all to learn from each other.
So one of the things that we did do, and one of the reasons why we are here, is we have a legislative committee, of which Kim and Christopher are co-chairs, and we have a racial justice committee, which Danielle is chair. And we began looking at, we're in this world, we work for crime victims, we provide services, but not often enough do we really ask victims what works for them, and what do they want, and what do they need, and what's their perception of justice. And we know one thing, we know that the majority of crime victims do not ever enter the criminal justice system, and a lot of us do not really acknowledge that or respect that. And and so what we decided is that we would go to victims ourselves. And and I'm going to ask Danielle, because Danielle is the chair and she spearheaded this with the committee, and it's been incredibly enlightening to all of us what we learned.
So and thank you again for having us here. It's such an honor and such a delight. And we know that you carry a really heavy burden, right? Like you carry the burden of really consequential decisions, and you balance the interests of parties who are sometimes aligned and sometimes not, and often the interests of parties who aren't in front of you, who you have to think about and care about and factor into your decision making as you try and be fair and hold the interests of everybody at heart. And so your interest in this work and the thinking we've been doing is so heartening, as a New Yorker, to receive that from you. So we're grateful for it. Part of what we did is we wanted to make sure, like with any practice, that the way we were thinking and talking about crime victims' needs was current, right? That it was constantly recalibrated, that what we were learning in practice was factoring into our thinking. I think it's very easy for us to have a set of beliefs and then just do our work for decades, and not necessarily take the time to say, like, what does what we've learned from this work mean for those set of beliefs, right? And for what we should be doing. And particularly as a group that's often responsive to legislation. So a bill is proposed and we say, do we like it or not? Really thinking, what's our affirmative vision for what victims want, and what do we know? And so we listened first to the members of the coalition, so cumulatively people who together bring hundreds and hundreds of years of experience working with crime victims. And part of what was so striking is that diverse array of people who Michael described, from law enforcement, like police, prosecutors, people at OVS, people in direct service, people working with a whole range of victims, all came into alignment around the statement you see in front of you. And so the idea of the statement is it tries to draw out as much as we can for what we know are a wildly diverse array of people, a set of universal principles of what victims really want. And I think it distills down to two primary things. One is that, and I'll say a little bit about both and then hand it over to my wonderful colleagues. One is that what victims want from the criminal justice system is not always what we expect. And two is victims want far more than from just the criminal justice system. And so in the first, what we know is that, and you'll see a national survey of crime victims that I shared with you, done by the Alliance for Safety and Justice. So that's not a downstate document, but it's one that informs some of our thinking. That found overwhelmingly, by a ratio of at least 2-to-1, that victims of crime support alternatives to incarceration instead of just punishment. I think we often think the only reason a victim would support an alternative to incarceration, would support diversion, would support, for example, parole, would be because of some degree of forgiveness or mercy or compassion. Someone who says, but for the grace of God, go I. And what we know is that victims are often highly pragmatic, right? That victims want the thing that they believe will secure their safety and other people's safety. And for many victims, they don't necessarily believe that prison or more prison is that thing. So even for victims who are rageful, the decisions they will make about what they want to see happen in response to what was done to them is not always the most severe punishment possible. We also know that the range of victims' voices that are heard in the criminal justice system are far too narrow. Fewer than half of victims of violence call the police in the first place. Another half of those cases don't make it past grand jury. A smaller portion of those result in convictions. And so for the vast majority of victims, the remedies that they are receiving or seeking will be outside that system. That's partly because the system is limited by constraints, like it does its best and it can't reach everyone. And it's partly because victims don't always choose to engage that system because they don't necessarily believe it will deliver them the safety and justice they deserve in the form that they want. And so the other thing we heard in listening to victims is that the range of things victims want extend far beyond the reach of the criminal justice system. Victims want safe housing. Victims want the ability to meet their own economic needs. Victims want the people who hurt them never to hurt anyone else again. And when possible, they want that to be because the person is transformed, not just because the person is gone. Victims want a sense of validation that what happened to them is wrong. And when they have that validation, their attachment to particular forms of punishment often shift. So often what victims are seeking from the criminal justice system is an acknowledgement of their pain. And I know you all bear witness to that all the time. You talk to people who need their pain seen, who need to say that they're not okay. What we know is that when a victim 5, 10, or 15 years after a crime is still hurting, it means that victim has not gotten the support they deserve to heal and transform. And that's our collective responsibility. So I know, as somebody who has read and listened to a great deal of victims' testimony before boards of parole, that when I, as a victim service provider, hear a victim say, I feel the same way I did as the very day I experienced this loss, I know that's trauma, right? That's what post-traumatic stress looks like. And I know that it is our collective responsibility to help deliver that person from that pain and to understand that not just as an opinion, but as a symptom, and to care for it as such. And so I will pause there and turn it over to my colleagues from downstate who bring just a really wide variety of experience with a wide range of victims to the conversation.
Do you want to start? So the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault works primarily with sexual assault victims. We are an umbrella organization over the rape crisis centers in New York City. We were created in order to give a voice to rape crisis centers, but also to survivors and their needs. And so we related to this statement in multiple different ways. I'll say that safety is a primary concern of sexual assault survivors. And in thinking about shelter, we in New York City, we have failed to think about sexual assault survivors, for example, needing shelter and needing housing. We also have failed to think about their economic security often. Many survivors of sexual assault can't perform the duties of their job after an assault for various reasons, in part because of the trauma, in part because of interruptions like court dates and other things. So we very much relate to that piece of the statement that safety and economic security are incredibly important. The other thing is that, Danielle alluded to this, that very few sexual assault cases are reported to authorities. So at this point, only about 32% of the sexual violence incidents that happen in the United States is an arrest made, for example. And so many survivors are doubtful that they're going to get the response that they want from the criminal justice system. But the other side of that coin is that you are probably looking from your perspective, as a parole officer, at a very serious case that had substantial amounts of evidence and was able to go forward, but also a statement of the survivor's ability to carry forth and participate in that system. The other thing is that many attackers are known to sexual assault victims, so there is this overlay, this complex overlay of relationship that can happen with sexual assault. Some survivors are sexually assaulted within the confines of an intimate partner relationship. Others by somebody they met 10 minutes beforehand in a bar. So that relationship can be of various levels of intensity. So some of the voice that we'd like, some of the statement is about listening to the voices of survivors and listening to what they might want out of a criminal justice process. So the moments that they are given in front of you to come to you and talk to you are extremely important to that survivor. I'm going to pass it on to Anne, and maybe you can talk about another aspect.
Certainly. I think what we all, as long-term victim advocates, really find beautiful about this affirmative vision is that it really has listened to an incredibly diverse collection of victims' voices, and specifically those voices that have been historically silenced. And so I want to speak specifically to one of those groups, victims of crime who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or queer identified, and how those voices are really represented here in this statement. Because although that group, just like like the group of crime victims, is incredibly diverse, and the needs of one person in that community may look very, very different from the needs of someone else in that community. But consistently, when we speak to queer-identified crime victims, we hear from them a reluctance to have the person who caused them harm experience punishment at the hands of the criminal legal system. And, that is based in a lot of history, and it's based in a lot of the complicated relationship that exists between, say, law enforcement, the criminal legal system, and the LGBTQ community. And what we hear from them is, like we all talked about, how they want their pain to be recognized and how they want someone to be able to provide them with the support that they're really looking for in the aftermath of this harm, which is what we really see here in the need for high-quality, culturally competent services where people can recognize that they can be seen and heard and valued, and that happens in that context.
At Safe Horizon, we work with victims of all crime, victims of child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, surviving members of homicide, community violence. And we have clients who will bring a case to court. It may be a civil case, it may be through the criminal justice system. And they have expectations for what that case is going to look like, which sadly looks like what it does on TV, which isn't actually what it looks like in real life. And we have clients who find that the criminal justice system or the civil system works. They had an expectation, the lawyer or the prosecutor did what they thought they would do, the judge and the jury ruled in the way that they hoped they would, and there is an outcome that lines up with what they had expected. And sometimes that's enough for what victims want. Oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes that's one piece of what's going to make that victim feel whole again. And the services that they receive or don't receive is going to be a major part. And then we have clients for whom the system doesn't work. The police officer doesn't believe them. The district attorney tries as hard as they can to make the case, but they're unable to convince a jury. Or a judge intimidates or doesn't seem to understand what the victim's voice is saying. And in those cases in particular, or maybe it's a civil case, it's so essential that not be the end-all and be-all for what we think victims need or what victims expect or what we owe victims as a society. So at Safe Horizon, we work really hard to work with victims and provide services to victims, whether they are successful in criminal court or not, whether a prosecutor is able to successfully bring a charge, whether somebody reported to the police and then decide they don't want to go forward with the investigation, or regardless of how a judge and a jury may rule, we're going to be there to provide the services. And the part of this statement that the survivor statement, which you guys have in front of you, which is so important, is this idea of access to high-quality, comprehensive, trauma-informed, culturally competent, language-accessible services. It's a mouthful, but it's really important to make sure that the people who've been harmed can get the help that they need above and beyond what any court proceeding may show. It's something that we take seriously. We work with crime victims who report to the police and then decide that they don't want to go forward with an investigation. We work with child victims of abuse where there's an investigation and they don't think they have enough evidence to hold anybody accountable. We're still going to work with that child. We're still going to work with the child's siblings and caregivers. It's such an important piece of what we do, and it's a part of this statement that almost above everything really solidifies the need for services to be available in a way that meets the needs of crime victims.
So the victim services community is one of the more progressive communities that exist, and we have a lot of progressive conversations. And one that we've started to have lately, because it's very much in the forefront, is that it is irresponsible of us as a community not to recognize that certain people who harm others have been harmed themselves, and that sometimes that is the reason for which they commit harm. And for the past 3 years, CVTC, the Crime Victims Treatment Center, we work with all survivors of violent crime. And we were approached by the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision to provide services to inmates who have disclosed sexual assault and sexual violence. And it has been a very eye-opening 3 years, having conversations with inmates who have experienced horrible, traumatic sexual violence while incarcerated. And one of the beautiful things about this statement is that it is incredibly diverse. It represents all victims, and it represents the voices of victims who feel different things and have experienced different things. And I think for an incarcerated survivor of sexual violence, it's an incredibly difficult place to experience sexual violence. There is very little safety within a facility of corrections, and I think that for us, providing services to individuals who have experienced sexual assault while incarcerated, it's hard to give them a sense of safety that many victims can feel outside of that, because they are in a setting where the victimization can continue. There's no exit. And so I think that one of the things we look at as a victim services community is that providing access to trauma-informed, comprehensive services, providing services that help people heal, help people change. It helps to break cycles of victimization. It helps to break cycles of abuse. And that's a really important thing for us to offer. Speaking with inmates and their families, many families of people who are incarcerated want that person to change. They want them to have access to the services that are going to help them not commit harm. And that's one thing that is really important for victim service providers to offer as well, because we know that victims come in all shapes and sizes. Survivors look like all of us, they look very different, and they look like anybody you can imagine. And so it's important to make sure that people have access to heal and to change.
And I'll echo my colleagues again, saying that these statements, the beauty is that they are voices of a lot of different survivors, and especially the documented or undocumented immigrants. I work as a clinician at the Crime Victims Treatment Center, and as a Spanish speaker, I get to work with a lot of folks from different countries, and getting to know their needs and their wants and how this statement matches that. Oftentimes, they're barred from economic empowerment and self-sufficiency. I'm thinking a lot about domestic violence survivors who are undocumented, talking about limited services for folks who have experienced domestic violence, and then even a more limited pool of opportunity for those who are undocumented. And so taking those kinds of things into consideration. But along with, the limited services that are not available, there's also respecting, as we've all said, the voices of these survivors, regardless of their immigrant status or their being undocumented or not. That they have the right to feel safe in whatever that is. And so I feel like I'm repeating a lot of what my colleagues have said. But when we're talking about a population that has very limited resources, it's extremely important for them to have a voice and to be heard. And so to give them the space to do that, to be heard here and on other platforms, to not assume that deportation is what they want from their perpetrator, that it might have an impact on their income, the life of their child, or their safety of the family and friends that live in their home country. And so being open to hearing what those concerns may be.
Thanks, Kim. I'm just, excuse me.
I was just going to turn it over to questions.
Okay, I just wanted to say, I haven't had a chance to say.
I'm sorry.
We haven't really heard
I thought you were opening.
I'll be really brief now. Just to give you a sense of because I don't want to repeat everything either that was said. The process and the process that we went through was, as Danielle had said, it started with the coalition and discussion with the members of the coalition. Which included, I have to say, law enforcement, criminal justice folks, as well as us, and which was very clear. And but then we went to the victims and we went to the programs, and so it was counselors and administrators that were interviewing victims, and we had a significant number. And this is what, and what came out with this statement. It shocked some, but did not shock most of us, and because 40 years I've been doing this work, and working with victims of all crimes and forms of violence, but just to take, it's not now that we're talking about victims of intimate partner violence and domestic violence, and why is the reporting rate so low? There's reasons why the reporting rate is so low, and why we can't get them to follow through, even if there's aggressive follow-up after an arrest. There's so many. Again, it's what we've learned is that victims are more forgiving than we ever thought, yet they want justice. Their perception of justice is different and varies, and we have a criminal justice system that meets part of their needs, but not most of them. And this was very, I think, controversial for us, and difficult for us to really grapple with, and we still are grappling with this because it's been reinforced over and over again when this issue comes up, and we are, coming to you to actually share this with you, because we're not going to be the only crime victims coalition and advocacy groups that are talking about this, and so I think that this is a beginning. And we welcome your ideas and what you're thinking right now, because I think that this is very vanguard, and we're taking some really big leaps here, and I'm really proud of the Downstate Coalition for taking this step, and I'm being honest about it. Okay.
May I ask, before we open it up to questions from the members and some dialogue, could someone read the points in the statement of what survivors and victims want, because the record won't reflect it otherwise. So if one of you would kindly read it, or you can take turns, however you want to do it.
Go down this way.
So should we do two each? Okay, we'll do two. Survivors and victims want: 1, recognition of and an end to racial bias and inequity in the criminal justice system, other institutions, and society as a whole. Safety secured for themselves and others in the immediate and long term. They want the harmful behavior to stop. They do not want to be re-victimized.
They want validation that what was done to them is wrong. They want safe options to disclose what happened to them. They do not want to be judged or blamed. Some want the opportunity to speak out about what happened, including at times addressing the person who harmed them. They want access to high-quality, comprehensive, trauma-informed, culturally competent, language-accessible services to help them and their families heal.
Survivors want access to safe, temporary, transitional, and permanent housing. They want the option to stay connected without stigma to their communities. They want to be able to choose whether or not to relocate housing, employment, and education.
Survivors want opportunities for economic empowerment and self-sufficiency, including meaningful employment. Survivors want substantial investments in services and institutions in society that will prevent violence from happening in the first place.
And they want the people who harm them to be held meaningfully accountable. Many survivors and victims find the criminal justice system, including incarceration, to be inadequate and or counterproductive to that end.
So members, or many want people who commit harm to have access to services that they need to stop harming themselves and others.
And victims and survivors want to be acknowledged and respected as experts on their own experience by every institution they and their loved ones encounter. They want these institutions to respond to their needs, take their input seriously, and uphold their dignity and safety at all times.
Thank you for sharing that. And again, before we open up to questions, I just want to invite Director Kopash. If you have anything you wish to add, if you want to talk about your work with members of this group historically and in the context of your day-to-day work, we'd certainly appreciate hearing from you.
I have been working with the Downstate Coalition for almost 20 years. They have been wonderfully informative and inspirational, And I think the doors have been opened wider for victims to come forward and make statements to the parole board because of things that I've learned through the Downstate Coalition and these very important topics of conversation that we've had. We've been able to allow incarcerated victims to make a telephone statement. The one case, the first one that I did, it was the father of a murder victim who had subsequently become an addict. He was self-medicating with drugs and alcohol as a result of his child's murder. And I was able to hook up a call. He was sitting in county jail pending a charge. And I was able to work with the sheriff in that county, and that father's voice was heard. He gave his statement over the phone to a member of the parole board. So it's that type of, let's open the door as wide as we can for victims who want to participate, and it's their choice, not mine. We are going to strive to open that door as wide as we can.
Thank you. All right. Now, without any further ado, unless there's anything else you wish to add, I'll invite questions and conversation. Commissioner Smith.
You mentioned a little bit about legislative initiatives. And that being your committee, or you being part of that, I'm curious as to what that might be. Also, are all the programs part of or funded in part by Office of Victim Services? Is that basically where a portion of your
Most of them
funds come? Okay. My background in '86 was with Crime Victims Board, so that's why. But I'm curious about legislative initiatives.
Yeah, so each year we look at different pieces of legislation that have been proposed that somehow relate to victims' needs or will have an effect on victims. So we look at a lot of sentencing bills, a lot of crime penalty bills, and we advocate for them. So, I mean, a few examples of things that we're looking at. We've been fighting very hard for the Child Victims Act for the past 10 years, which eliminates a criminal and civil statute of limitations for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. The law right now says that once a survivor turns 23, his or her options of reporting go away completely. So we would like to see that change. We're looking at things like raise the age. Raising the criminal age of responsibility feels like an important thing to the Downstate Coalition. We look at a lot of budget issues, making sure that crime victims programs receive the funding that they need around sexual assault specifically, or elder abuse programs, and many other things. Yeah.
And we'll when we say we advocate for something, that could include trips to Albany to meet with legislators or meeting with folks back in their districts. It could mean memos of support or memos of opposition. It could be meetings with the governor's office, everything in terms of how we will proceed with our agenda.
And I was just handed a copy of the legislative committee's list of legislative initiatives, so I'll be happy to share that with board members.
with the understanding that it changes all the time. But this is, yes. But, and just to add to what Michael said, it's like thanks to Michael and Christopher and Kim and the committee, which is, you're on it too. Incredibly active, very, very, very good at what they do. And, we have a seat many times talking to the governor as a result, of this. And so, this didn't happen 10 years ago. So this is very promising. Legislatively, we're getting things done.
I was delighted a few years ago to be a part of the effort in favor of all crimes DNA bill, and it was a beautiful partnership between the advocacy community, survivors, and government to get that legislation passed.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
I know what it looks like when it works and when it works well.
Do all of you or any of you work closely with the DA's offices?
Yes. We all.
So one of the things that I think happened, Janet can probably speak better on this than I can, but the process is difficult, I think, for victims, and they don't understand, and therefore DAs come and go, and whether or not when they signed up as victims and they were given the form and so on and so forth, and then all of a sudden this interview's coming up and they weren't contacted, or the person, most of the time this happens when somebody was granted an open date. That's when they really get upset, because if they weren't granted an open date, then, maybe they don't care about it. But the point is, it seems that from the point of sentencing to the point of a parole interview, there was a disconnect. We don't know who it was, but you work with them to kind of assure that people are given the right forms, that they're told that if they change their address, all those things, so that they don't come back later saying they weren't informed about the interview or whatever was happening.
And I think too that for survivors, what survivors want from the criminal justice system changes over time. It changes in a healing process. It changes as their lives progress. And so there is also, on the whole, more systematic and effective outreach from district attorneys' offices to survivors who oppose parole than to survivors who would be supportive of it. That very often survivors who are supportive of it may have the experience, even through the prosecution, of expressing some ambivalence about that person's incarceration or lengthy incarceration. If when they express that ambivalence, they don't see that respected, like they say, I want that person to have an alternative, I want that person rehabilitated, I want that person to get to change. If that's disrespected in their experience and the person is sentenced to a lengthy prison sentence instead, they're very unlikely to expect that if they come back again and express that same set of views, that those views will be upheld. And so you all have this enormous responsibility and a sort of artificially monolithic subset of victims. That it is mostly victims who believe their voices will be valued, who's often victims who have felt their voices were valued previously in the process. And very often as a victim in the criminal justice system, the only time your voice is valued is when the thing you are saying with that voice is that you want punishment. So we know that many of our victims across the field of who we talk to are sort of pathologized if they don't want the maximum penalty. They're told that they're self-blaming, or they're told that they're making excuses for the person, or they're told all sorts of things about themselves if they have something other than a constant desire for the maximum penalty. And so many of those victims will divest from the criminal justice system if they don't see themselves echoed in it. And so one of the things that we try and do, though it's challenging, is to ensure that even victims who say, like, I'm at peace now, I'm ready for this person to come home, or my healing and his incarceration are no longer connected to each other, that those victims come to you too, but it's a much heavier lift.
And please do that. Please do that. They can register for VINE to be notified of changes in status, of course. And in certain cases, as I said, they have a right to be heard. And anybody can write a letter. And we get letters from anybody and everybody. People not even connected in any personal way to the event write us letters. So, but we would love to hear from the people who were connected and who do have a viewpoint, even if it isn't lengthy incarceration.
Right. I do think that's a really important question, actually. I do think it is maybe a little bit of a gap that we don't always think about. We don't always. Many of us are so consumed with the acute care, the crisis right after the crime, that it's more difficult to stay in contact with somebody as they go through, as Danielle was saying, they go through these different sort of iterations of their experience with the crime. It is hard, it may be 10, it may be 7, it may be 6 years down the road, right? And so that probably is a gap that we could put our heads together and think about in terms of preparing people for, parole hearings. I also have seen sort of online some really interesting sort of frequently asked questions of victims might have about parole that might be interesting to look at together as a group. I noticed when I was doing some research for this talk that there are some states that have some very sort of interactive, frequently asked questions and stuff that give victims a very good idea of what the process is about and what it's like that might help fill that gap a little bit, but that's just some ideas.
I think overall, my original concern is that the process can be strengthened on both sides. One, and the DA, should be ambivalent. It shouldn't matter how you feel about crime. At the end of the day, if their job is to hand you a form and say, fill this out in the event you want to give a statement some years later, 2 years later, 25 years later, the parole board or docs will notify you. And we find out that victims say later they were never given that form, they were never told they can, sign up. So that's only one part of it. But actually, when you answered the second part of my question, is that, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak, right? And in reading over this, the one point here, it says 6 in 10 victims prefer shorter prison sentences and more spending on prevention. I would say that in the many that I've interviewed, I think I've had 1 or 2 that reflected that statement. The vast majority don't ever let them out. And the thing is that when I was a little surprised when I saw 6 in 10. It seems pretty close. Where are the other people in this count? But 6 in 10 in favor, we don't see that, and at least I don't. And we do interviews from all across the state. I interview people from New York City, from Buffalo, from everywhere in the state. We all do. We don't have, if you live in New York City, you're a commissioner there. You don't only interview people from New York City. We do the phone interviews. So we get the full range of people. We even get people who don't realize that, the inmate may have a conditional release date and they're getting out in a few months. Yeah. Your statement is strong, whatever you say, but they don't know the process. But at the end of the day, I don't believe any of us can say that we see the 6 in 10 in favor.
Yeah, well, I think because you see fewer than half of victims call the police in the first place, you're never talking to any of them. There's half that don't make it to the grand jury. You're not hearing from any of them. There's all the ones that don't result in conviction. None of those voices make it to you, right? And then there are the people who...
Well, they wouldn't be relevant because if they're not
right.
convicted...
No, that's right. No, that's what I mean. But it means you have this very tiny subset of victims whose voices you're hearing. And part of why we were so thankful for this opportunity is to be able to say, you are people who answer to crime victims and who care about crime victims. And so being able to say, this is what we're hearing from the full range of crime victims, including those who may not come to you, and including victims where as they heal, they develop an indifference. They're like, all I want is to not go to court again, to not talk about this again, to not answer the call again. No, I don't want to update my address with you. I want it to be gone. I want it to be over. I want to move on. That even those victims are people you don't hear from. And our hope is that in partnership we can offer you the broad spectrum of what victims want and ask and seek to fill out those gaps that you're totally right are just defined by the process.
And for the sake of clarity, the group that was polled that gave those numbers was the broader group.
That's right.
Yeah.
Unreporting, unconvicted,
Everybody.
crime survivors.
And I mean, it definitely gives us enormous challenges in what we look at, and how we face the future. And, we didn't even talk about prevention. What is our investment in prevention when victims talk about it all the time in different ways? And so we're straddling with this, but we need all the elements working together, Right now, I mean, the police are going through an incredible experience with special training, which is forensic, experiential training, and finally learning about the brain and the neurological, aspects of the brain in trauma during, an episode of violence. All right, they're learning very different things, and what it's doing is hopefully change the way that they interview, but it's changing their training in many ways. We'll see how that plays out, right? But at least I give them credit for looking at this, and looking at victims in a very, very different way, and so we'll see. It's
There was
it's
a question. I'm sorry. I may have been the only one who saw.
Just to follow up Commissioner Parole about conditional release date. I've interviewed so many people who don't understand that a conditional release date is on the table for the city.
Yeah.
And they never were told that from the beginning. And that's a huge issue when they're told, there's nothing basically that we can stop if they're getting out. And that is a big deal. And it's all, when you have to break that news to them, that is a very big deal. And, you know, personally, when I take a victim impact statement, especially the ones that are coming in repeatedly or coming in every 6 months because there's multiple co-defendants, I try to let them know that their prior statements can stand because, as you said, some people need to put this to bed. You know, and I let them know that it's their interview. You know, and it's about their loved one. But if they can't keep revisiting this every 2 years, every 6 months, whatever it might be, that's okay too. You know, that it's their call.
And the law recently changed to mandate that the board members on the panel conducting the interview consider every statement submitted by the relevant victim or surviving family member from the very first until the most recent. So.
Probably for those who are victims of sexual assault, but also domestic violence and crimes like that. How often do you help them understand what will happen when whoever it may have been who assaulted them, whether it's a husband or a family member or just a stranger, when they're fearful of that person now is coming out, right? Especially, I think, when it's more personal and there's an attachment there, a husband or a spouse or whatever it may be. So, because I've interviewed for some where, as Commissioner Smith said, that, you know, they may know they're coming out, or, you know, whether it's a conditional release date or maxing out or whatever it may be. But a lot of their fears around what's going to happen now if he comes after me, or we'll say she, because we know that men could be, you know, victims too. I found that a lot of them don't understand the parole process. And I did explain to one group, and I was a little surprised because Victim Services was there, not your office, but somebody from a county, I won't say which one. Their county Victim Services were there in the interview. They sat with me, and they did not know this, that most of those domestic violence cases, those individuals are put on a GPS ankle bracelet. And they are, you know, it helps the victim know that there's something more than just, okay, he's paroled or she's paroled, and we'll never, you know, hopefully they'll just listen to what they're told. There are extra steps taken with certain types of crimes, especially with domestic violence. So do you ever help victims over that fear? And have you ever had parole officers or parole staff come and say, you know, speak as a group and train you or let you know, these are the things, this is how we monitor and supervise these particular caseloads. We take extra measures. We don't just say, okay, just, you know, there's not a difference between somebody who has a larcenous background or domestic violence or sexual assault. Do you tell the victims that to help them over that fear of there's a little bit more attention paid to those individuals?
If you want to, I mean, in New York City, we have I can speak specifically to survivors of intimate partner violence. In New York City, we have 5 family justice centers, which are the primary provider of services to survivors of intimate partner violence. And the vast majority of the advocates who work in those centers have knowledge about the entirety of the criminal justice process and would absolutely do intensified safety planning at the point in which someone's abusive partner is being released from prison. But it's also a good reminder that the vast majority of survivors of intimate partner violence, their abusive partner is being arrested for a misdemeanor level offense and will never have any contact with prison at all. So it's such a small group of survivors of intimate partner violence specifically whose abusive partners are doing any upstate time. But in the rare case that that's happening, we're doing really intensified safety planning. Yeah, we're very familiar with the whole process.
And maybe we can entertain an idea to have some members of the parole board present at downstate. Because I think that there are big gaps, you know, and all systems do change, you know, and so in terms of like how we could really help survivors better, you know, with better knowledge, you know. We can talk about that.
Yes, we will.
Okay.
We'll talk about that. I have some. Was there any others?
Just as a follow-up on the domestic violence piece, we have a program in DOCS ART, which is anger reduction training. We don't specifically anymore have domestic violence training, treatment programs. Is that something that you'd like to see implemented within the agency?
Yeah.
Is that a question to us? Or
Yeah. No, my question is to the coalition. Is that something that you would recommend the agency look into?
And what is the research on that? Because I remember years ago hearing some different statements about the efficacy of domestic violence treatment programs for those committing the harm.
It's controversial still, but I think, I think the thinking is also now, it's like we do have to take some risks and try some different kind of programming, in terms of treatment. In Canada and the UK, they do treat, and they with some success, and with some not. I think that we get phone calls in our program of people who call for the very first time that they hit their partner and it scared them, and there's no place for them to go. Okay, unless they've got insurance, and to see, a counselor or something like that. There really isn't any place for them to go, and classically, they grew up in violent homes. We see this, a lot, and so I think there's much that we can still do that we're not doing.
We see it play out too sometimes once someone is paroled. They are released conditionally or they are released discretionarily, and now we're seeing them potentially come back into state custody on a parole revocation because of an incident with the new girlfriend or someone that they've been involved with before they were incarcerated and gone home to. And we take the opportunity many times during our interviews to talk to men and women about the stress that they will assuredly feel and encounter upon their reentry back into their families. And we suggest to them to be patient with themselves. Parole officers often suggest that they delay going right from prison to home, and maybe something in the middle until they, get their bearing again. Commissioner Cruz, you had a question or comment?
I just wanted to, back up a bit to Christopher's comment. You had mentioned raise the age, which is a legislation that there's talk that there's a strong possibility that it will be passed, during this session. And a lot of those that fall into that category, they're young and they're still in prison. They are from time to time victims of sexual violence in prison. And then, if the process rises to the level that they happen to be released, they're now in the community traumatic, traumatized from their experience, and may not have gotten any specific address for that while in sight. So, a number of different agencies are represented. What work are you doing in and around that? And what might be some of your thinking in regard to those young, formerly incarcerated individuals who have had sexual violence against themselves, and in all likelihood or possibility had domestic violence experiences at home prior to their incarceration? So just wanted to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so we have a lot of room to grow in that area. I think there's a real lack of pointed services for young people coming out of prison who have experienced those sorts of things. And what we've learned from working with incarcerated and non-incarcerated people is that so many of those people have histories of childhood sexual abuse before they even get into prison. So that's a thing that's been unaddressed. So, our program, we work with a few, the ones that find us. We don't pointedly go after that population because it's hard for us to get access to that. But we know the work that we do in terms of victim services and focusing on trauma and giving people an opportunity to process what's happened to them and heal from it, that starts to break cycles. That changes the way they behave. It changes the way they look at things. And it's effective, but there's a lack of opportunity to access it, right? Am I wrong?
Yeah. We would like there to be more services that act as treatment rather than punishment and address the huge issues of mental health and emotional stability and working on the trauma that they've experienced. Kind of our opportunity to catch what maybe should have been caught a long time ago.
And one thing that actually will make that easier is that the VOCA regulations changed. So our funding used to prohibit us from working with people who had been incarcerated. We weren't allowed to do it.
So it's increased?
That's changed. So that is no longer a rule. We're able to work with people who were incarcerated or who are incarcerated who are victims. So that's a thing that changed in October. Okay. And we'll start to kind of shift the sand a little bit.
Our conscious and effort is to hopefully address the younger population when they come before us as best we can, given our authority. So in saying it, when you mention access or the lack thereof before, I would just hope that we all in our work could step up our effort pre-incarceration. It'll save something on the back end. And probably save them some experiences that would never have the opportunity to evolve if we're successful in that effort. I know that your facility, and we talked a little bit at the top, addresses young people, their residents, their safety, and whatever they happen to tell you. And the strategies of how we access that group, I think, need some aggressive attention because we're missing them, and we're missing the opportunity that we need on the front end.
Thank you. We have to go. We have to catch a train. But we'll come back.
I just had one comment with respect to the immigration issue. If there's a final order of deportation, it's nothing we can say yes or no to if there's an order. Right. So, victims, survivors need to know that there's a final order. The board of parole is not decided if they don't go. Right. There's an order they're going. Right. So they need to know that's.
Well, there are. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I don't have offhand any announcements or invitations. If I've received anything and neglected to bring it with me, I will share it with you via email. I thank you all for coming for the meeting and making sure we had a quorum for today for our distinguished presenters. At this time, I will entertain a motion to adjourn unless there are any further items of new business or announcements that you wish to make at this time. Okay.
Are we adjourning? Going into executive session?
We are adjourning because we do not have to make a motion to adjourn to discuss matters with our counsel that are otherwise confidential per open meetings law. And we do not have any other confidential information related to personnel issues or otherwise to go into executive session. So this is a pure motion to adjourn the meeting. So any other questions? The motion was made by who? And second, was there a second?
Awesome.
And second by Commissioner Thompson. Any other questions or discussion? All in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.